Air Force One ready to touch down at Orlando International Airport, bringing the president to the scene of the largest terror attack on U.S. soil since 9/11.
Obviously landing at Orlando International Airport, where he will be meeting shortly with the family members of the victims of those 49 who were killed early Sunday morning at Pulse nightclub. He will also meet, of course, with those survivors. Stories that we have heard over the last 2 or 3 days of just unbelievable recovery and stories about how they hid in order to survive.
Let me just point out, he's not going to meet with those people at the airport. He's actually going to travel down the Beeline Expressway to Interstate 4 and to downtown Orlando, where he will meet them at the Amway Center there. His job is to essentially try and console Americans reeling from the dawn of a new era of mass casualties, the lone wolf, homegrown terrorism that authorities have long feared. Channel 4's Nicole Snyder is there on the ground at the tarmac at Orlando International Airport. Nicole.
Right now that Air Force One has landed and the president should be taxiing over here shortly. He is here to visit again with the victims' families and also with the first responders, nurses and doctors that were involved in this attack this weekend. This is obviously going to be a very emotional visit following this devastating shooting this weekend at Pulse nightclub. The White House secretary says he is here to pay respects to the victims of the country's worst shooting massacre and to stand in solidarity with the community. Right now, the details of his visit are limited, but he's expected to head over to the Amway Center, which is about 20 or 25 minutes from the airport, to attend a prayer vigil. While in Orlando, again, he will visit with those victims' families and all those who were injured in this attack. On this trip, Vice President Joe Biden is joining him, as he has already landed here. Governor Rick Scott is already here too. He's expected to meet President Obama at the gate here on the tarmac, and other officials that will be here during portions of his trip include Senator Marco Rubio and Senator Bill Nelson, as well as Representative Corrine Brown, who represents the district where this shooting happened. And again, this is expected to be a very emotional visit. A lot of the political arena buzzing this week about gun control topics, which both sides have addressed this week, as well as the president. But we're told this visit will strictly be about the victims affected by this shooting and their families, and helping with healing and recovery. And as we take a look over here, we do see the Air Force One that headed farther behind, now out of view. We are on the media staging area, trying to see when exactly he will be coming over here.
Nicole, if I might intervene, you're at a part of the airport.
Oh,
you're at a part of the airport they call the FBO. Basically, they come down the runway to the taxiway, and the pilot turns the plane around, and he'll come to the staging area. That's Air Force One moving towards you right now.
Yep, we have Air Force One moving towards us.
Unfortunately for the president and human, for the rest of our country, he has had the same experience. And Nicole, then, do you see that Senator Rubio and Senator Nelson, that are there obviously to greet him?
Expect the president to share the grief of the victims' families on behalf of the nation. By the way, I also do want to point out that the vice president and the president never traveled together. The president's not expected to make any remarks after bounding off Air Force One. He will greet local and state dignitaries. As Jen mentioned, Governor Rick Scott is there, as are Senators Marco Rubio and Bill Nelson. It'll take a couple of short minutes. They'll open the door to Air Force One. The president will come bounding down. There will be a red carpet. And after he meets and greets local officials, he'll be whisked away in the presidential limo to meet the victims and their families, as well as the doctors, trauma surgeons, nurses, and staff at Orlando Regional Medical Center. We have been told by the White House that the president will make a statement before leaving Central Florida later this afternoon. Scheduled departure time is about 5:20.
We've also learned that the president is expected to meet, in fact, tomorrow, as we've been hearing so much, certainly about the war on terror, with the Saudi Arabia's Deputy Crown Prince to discuss Syria, Yemen, and the war on ISIS. fact, you'll remember the president just said 2 days ago, after a meeting with his security counselors on Tuesday outside the U.S. Treasury, that this lone wolf, this homegrown terrorist, committed a terrible act, and that the country is doing everything it can, everything possible to stop these kinds of attacks. But it is certainly difficult, and it takes everyone's involvement, including security, and also reminding everyone they need to be on a heightened state of alert, considering the fact that we're in the Ramadan holiday is approaching, as well as the 4th of July.
What makes this particularly intriguing is that Orlando is seen as one of America's happiest cities, and it has been battered by tragedy over the course of the past 3 days. This, by the way, is not the first time the president had to make a trip like this to a mass casualty situation during the course of his administration. There you see Governor Scott in the blue blazer to his left. There are Secret Service agents on the ground. I don't recognize the other dignitaries, and I don't see signs of either Bill Nelson or Marco Rubio at this point.
That looks like Mayor Buddy Dwyer.
That is Mayor Buddy Dwyer of Orlando. Yes. It is interesting that Rick Scott is meeting him there on the tarmac. If you've been following any of the interviews that he's done here on Channel 4 with me while I was in Orlando, and also with the various networks, the governor has been very critical of the president because up until yesterday, Mr. Obama had not called him. And Governor Scott basically told me in a very impassioned way, you know what, the people who live here, the 20 million people who live here, the 100 million people who visit here, they are my responsibility. And I don't understand why the White House hasn't called me. There is no place for politics in a situation like this. The hatch you see opening is where the crew is in the belly. Usually there's some press people there. The president will come up from the top tier where the steps are being opened right now. He will come bounding down those steps. I'm actually surprised there's no red carpet. That's the Air Force aide who is working with airport personnel to stage those steps right now. There you see the seal for the President of the United States. And again, we don't expect him to make any comments at this time.
We'll make some comments, though, later this afternoon. In fact, he's only expected to be in the Orlando area for about 5 hours. Again, as we mentioned, once he meets with Governor Scott and the other dignitaries there, the mayors, he will then head to the Amway Center where a prayer vigil is expected. After that, expected, of course, then to meet with the families of those who lost, those 49 just poor souls, of course, who were killed early Sunday morning. And then also meeting with the survivors, stories that we have heard over the last 2 or 3 days, and the doctors. I mean, we heard their impassioned, some of them, in fact, Bruce, very emotional, talking about the scene that unfolded at the emergency rooms and the trauma centers, certainly, to help try to save the lives of those 49 survivors.
As they secure those stairs and we wait for the president, let me bring Channel 4's Vic Micolucci into the fold. Vic is at the Amway Center. Set the stage for us, Vic. Pardon me? He is there awaiting the president. Okay, so we'll have coverage from the Amway Center later this morning. The president should appear sometime in the next 30 to 40 seconds if traditional protocol does hold here. He has a private suite that's essentially in the back of Air Force One and a traveling Oval Office. He travels with a contingent of White House aides. He has been briefed on the latest involving the investigation into the mass shooting in Orlando. Mentioned that he's going to meet with the victims and the victims' families, but also with the police who confronted the gunman, the staff at ORMC, the trauma surgeons, the doctors, the nurses, the technicians. Even we have heard some of these surviving bar patrons who were still standing, who helped the wounded. Senator Marco Rubio and Congresswoman Corrine Brown on board Air Force One with President Obama.
As he's stepping down, of course, to be greeted by the governor. This has been described as a meeting about standing in solidarity with the community, shoulder to shoulder, if you will, with the people of Orlando, offering the condolences and also the support to those who have been most impacted by this heinous crime that happened just 3 days ago.
Talking now to Orlando Mayor Buddy Dwyer, just to the president's right, Governor Rick Scott, and in front of the Buddy Dwyer, and in front of the governor is Vice President Joe Biden, who arrived just a little bit earlier this morning. He and Senator Marco Rubio engaged in a discussion. It'll be interesting to see when he makes his remarks upon leaving at about 5:20 this afternoon, whether or not the president talks just about his conversations with the victims and the grief that they shared with him, or if he chooses to make a political statement.
interesting because for all accounts and purposes, from what we're hearing, he does want to try to keep politics out of it, but you never know, considering the fact that there has been a lot of discussion about gun control. In fact, we saw on the congressional floor, of course, the filibuster urging Congress to make dramatic changes. And as the president and the vice president prepare to leave Orlando International Airport, you can see Senator Nelson there with them, as well as Marco Rubio. And they will head then to the Amway Center to begin their day.
Not sure why Senator Nelson wasn't on Air Force One. I know he'd been at the staging area, the media staging area, for a couple of days, so perhaps he was home in Melbourne and decided to just drive on up, and that's why he didn't travel with the president from Washington, D.C., and ultimately take off from Joint Air Base Andrews. The vice president and president sitting side by side in the presidential limousine. They will pull off the tarmac there. The Secret Service escort will travel with them, take them down the Beeline Expressway to Interstate 4 and the Amway Center. The Amway Center, for those of you not familiar, is staged right off Interstate 4. It is the home to the Orlando Magic, a variety of concerts, and I don't believe that it's seen a scene of tragedy like this before, and the emotion will certainly be running high. Secret Service standing by the presidential limo as the driver makes sure everybody is in and buckled and ready to go before they begin the 25-minute trip to the Amway Center.
And of course, we are covering the president and vice president's visit to Orlando moment by moment. We have crews there. Nicole Schneider, of course, at the airport will be there when the president leaves at about 5:20 this afternoon. And Vic Michelucci is also going to bring us reports from the Amway Center once the president and vice president arrive there in about 25-30 minutes. Throughout the day, of course, the president is expected to address the media and the public after his meeting, after he meets with the victims' families, with survivors, as well as doctors and first responders.
By the way, when that happens throughout the course of the day, when we're not on the air, you can always go to our mobile device and news4jax.com for updated information throughout the course of the day. Waiting for the presidential limo to pull on out. President talking to Senator Joe Biden, sitting next to him. And it's for obvious reasons that the two of them don't travel together. So something untoward happened. You don't want the two leaders of the most powerful nation in the world to be in a situation where there could be peril. There's a broader view. You see the presidential limo. It is an armored vehicle. They always bring a second limo, too, by the way. And there will be a cotillion of press that will follow the presidential limo and stage at the Amway Center. There are those who always travel with the president and follow his every waking moment, if you will.
And we should note, of course, that Orlando Regional, the hospital down there, updated us, in fact, just this morning. 25 people are still in the hospital. 6 of them are still in critical condition. And we heard, in fact, just this week from the trauma surgeons that 1 or 2 of them may not make a full recovery. 50 surgeries have been, can you believe 50, since Sunday morning.
Yeah, and word is that 3 more surgeries are scheduled for today. You've got to imagine the extent of some of the wounds that these people suffered. And because they were in life-threatening situations, the surgeons can only do so much before they worry about, the patients not being able to withstand any more medical care.
And as we watch the president and vice president leaving, headed now to the Amway Center, which, as Bruce mentions, about 25-30-minute drive away. At that time, they'll be attending a prayer vigil, then also meeting with families of those impacted by this terrible tragedy that occurred, as well as the first responders and doctors. And you can count on our coverage throughout the day.
The procession continues. As I mentioned, it'll be 20 minutes to a half an hour, depending on traffic. And for those who live in the Orlando area, they'll find that the Beeline Expressway, which is a major toll road, even parts of I-4 will be shut down in order to accommodate the presidential motorcade as it makes its way to the Amway Center.